The sun had not yet broken the horizon when the city began to hum. In quiet preparation for another day, streetlights glowed faintly, taxis rolled lazily down near empty streets, and the air carried that cool, delicate stillness that only existed before dawn. Somewhere far above those streets, in the tallest residential tower for miles, Clara Marin swiped her ID card against the service entrance and stepped inside. Her breath formed a faint cloud in the early chill of the hallway. She moved with practiced silence, her flat-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floors. Years of working as a maid for people she would never truly know had taught her the art of moving through spaces like a shadow, always present, never noticed. Clara had long since given up expecting surprises in this job. The days followed a predictable rhythm: dust, polish, straighten, repeat. Yet, somewhere in the back of her mind, she still carried a spark, the kind of quiet hope that life could still throw something unexpected in her path. She didn't know why she still felt it. Perhaps it was because once upon a time, before everything had gone wrong, she had been training to become a nurse. She stepped into the Langford penthouse with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. It was beautiful in the way a gallery was beautiful, every item curated, every surface gleaming, every flower arrangement replaced before the first petal could fall. She set down her cleaning tote in the hallway and reached to pull her hair into a tighter bun. The space was silent, as usual. Mr. Langford was an early riser, but rarely in the common rooms before she finished her morning tasks. Clara began her routine, dusting the grand piano that no one seemed to play, aligning the crystal glasses so their rims caught the soft light spilling through the curtains. Her mind wandered. Rent was due next week. Her sister's medicine was almost finished. She would need to work extra shifts, maybe even take weekend work. She moved to the far side of the living room, mop in hand, and that was when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the air conditioning, a faint, uneven hum. But then it came again, sharper, like a strained gasp that didn't belong to the walls or the vents. She froze, head tilted, listening. The sound came from the far corner, near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Slowly, she stepped around the sofa, and her heart clenched. Daniel Langford, the man whose name sat on half the skyscrapers in this city, was slumped in one of the armchairs, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his hand gripping the armrest as if it was the only thing keeping him from sliding to the floor. His skin was pale, beads of sweat glistening at his temples despite the cool room. His chest rose and fell, in shallow bursts, each breath looking like it cost him more than the last. Clara's first instinct was to speak his name, but the words caught in her throat. She had seen this before, not here, not with a man in a tailored suit, but in a different life, wearing scrubs instead of this uniform. The signs came rushing back to her, the slight bluish tint to his lips, the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor in his fingers. Her pulse quickened. She took a step closer, crouching slightly. "Mr. Langford, can you hear me?" Her voice was soft but urgent. His eyelids fluttered. His gaze met hers for half a second before drifting away again. Unfocused, his lips moved, but whatever sound came out was little more than a broken breath. The air seemed to thicken. Clara's mind shifted into a clarity she hadn't felt in years, the kind that came from training, from hours of learning what to do when seconds mattered. She set the mop aside, kneeling in front of him. She pressed her fingers gently to the side of his neck. His pulse was rapid, erratic. There was no time to wait for anyone else. She glanced around. No aide, no assistant, no emergency kit in sight. Her own voice sounded distant in her ears as she told him to stay with her. That help was on the way, even though she hadn't yet called for it. She reached into her pocket for her phone, but then hesitated. Every second counted. She pulled the nearby ottoman closer and eased his legs up to elevate them slightly. "Keep breathing," she said, more to keep him focused than anything else. She needed something cool to lower his body temperature, but the nearest kitchen was across the vast living room, and she couldn't leave him. Her eyes fell on the silk scarf draped over the back of the chair beside them. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. She slid it gently behind his neck to support his head, speaking to him in a calm, steady voice the whole time. His breathing was uneven, but her presence seemed to anchor him. She could see him fighting to focus on her, as if some part of him recognized the urgency in her eyes. In the distance, she could hear the faint rush of the elevator. Someone else was coming, relief mixed with determination in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. She couldn't let go until she was certain he was safe. Clara had walked into the Langford penthouse expecting another quiet morning. She didn't yet realize that this single moment, her decision to step forward instead of stay frozen, would not only save his life but change hers forever. And somewhere deep inside, though she would never admit it out loud, that quiet spark she'd carried all these years had just flared into something brighter, something that felt a lot like fate. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that seemed far too calm for the urgency pounding in Clara's chest. She didn't look up at first. Her attention stayed locked on Daniel Langford's face, on the shallow, uneven breaths that pulled at his chest. She kept talking to him, her voice low but insistent, giving him small instructions. Stay with me, try to focus on my voice, breathe steady. Footsteps hurried across the marble, quick but muted, and then a voice spoke sharply behind her. What happened? Clara turned just enough to see a man in a dark suit rushing toward them, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked carved from stone. She recognized him immediately as Henry Cole, Mr. Langford's chief of staff, though they'd only ever exchanged brief nods in the hallway. He dropped to one knee opposite her without waiting for an answer, his phone already pressed to his ear. Emergency at the Langford penthouse, he barked. Send medical up now. Possible cardiac distress. Top floor. Clara didn't stop her work. She adjusted the scarf under Daniel's neck and checked his pulse again. Still rapid, but at least consistent now. Henry's gaze flicked over her hands with a trace of surprise, maybe even respect, but he said nothing. Within minutes, the quiet penthouse filled with sound, the clipped, efficient commands of paramedics, the wheeled rattle of a stretcher being maneuvered inside, the beeping of portable monitors. Clara stepped back, making room. But her eyes never left Daniel. She watched as they fitted an oxygen mask over his face, as they spoke to him in calm, practiced tones, as they moved him onto the stretcher with a fluidity that only came from experience. And then, just before they wheeled him toward the elevator, his eyes found hers. The contact lasted less than a second, but it held weight, a silent acknowledgement. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or just the recognition of a familiar voice in the chaos, but it rooted her to the spot until the elevator doors closed, and he was gone. The room felt strangely hollow in his absence. The expensive silence returned, but it was heavier now, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. Henry was still there, speaking into his phone, pacing near the windows. When he hung up, he turned to Clara. What exactly happened before I got here? His tone wasn't accusing, but it carried the force of someone used to getting answers. Quickly. Clara told him everything, from the moment she heard the faint sound near the windows, to the steps she took while waiting for help. She left out nothing, though she kept her voice steady and professional. Henry listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once. You may have saved his life. The words hit her harder than she expected. She gave a small, uncertain shrug. I just did what I knew to do. He studied her for a moment longer, as if reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet maid, who blended into the background. I'll make sure he knows, he said at last, then turned back to his phone. Clara gathered her cleaning tote and moved to leave, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She told herself it was just another day that, once Mr. Langford recovered, life would return to its usual rhythm. But a voice deep inside whispered that nothing about this morning would fade quietly into the past. By the time she returned to her small apartment that evening, the news had already spread. The television in the corner blared a business channel, the anchor's voice crisp as she reported, breaking news, Daniel Langford, CEO of Langford Enterprises, was rushed to hospital early this morning. Sources say he is in stable condition, following what appears to have been a sudden health episode. Details remain scarce, but insiders suggest quick action by someone on his household staff played a crucial role. Clara turned off the TV, her heart pounding again. She hadn't told anyone, not her sister, not her closest friend, and yet here it was, hinted at in public. She wondered if her name would surface, if anyone would care who she was. Part of her hoped it wouldn't. That night, she found sleep elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, pale, strained, searching for something in her expression. And she heard the unspoken question in that brief moment before they took him away. "Why are you helping me?" The following morning, when she arrived for her shift, Henry was waiting near the service entrance. He didn't say good morning. Instead, he handed her a folded note on thick paper, the kind that felt like it belonged in boardrooms rather than kitchens. "He asked me to give you this," Henry said simply. Clara unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was bold, deliberate. "Clara, I remember your voice. I'd like to see you. Please visit when you can." Daniel Langford, her breath caught. She hadn't even been sure he'd recognize her at all. She folded the note back into her palm, feeling the paper's weight as if it carried something far heavier than ink. She didn't know it yet, but accepting that invitation would draw her into a world she'd only ever glimpsed from a distance. A world of power, secrets, and choices that would test every bit of courage she thought she had. And once she stepped inside, there would be no going back. The decision hung in her mind all day, the note warm against her skin in her pocket. She told herself she was just curious, that she owed it to herself to hear what he had to say. But deep down, she sensed it was more than that. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the feeling that had ignited inside her that morning, the one she hadn't been able to name yet, but that was quietly, insistently, refusing to let go. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something warm, like brewed coffee from a distant nurse's station. Clara stepped through the automatic doors, the folded note in her pocket feeling heavier with each step. She had told herself she was only coming to check on him, to make sure he was all right, but that wasn't entirely true. A part of her wanted answers. Why had he asked for her? What could a man like Daniel Langford possibly have to say to someone like her? She moved past the reception desk without slowing, the memory of Henry's quiet instructions from that morning, guiding her. "Private wing, room 502, just show your ID." She expected questions, perhaps even resistance. But when the security guard glanced at her badge and nodded her through, she felt a twinge of unease. This was too easy. The private wing was silent in a way that made every sound stand out. The soft squeak of her shoes on polished tile, the distant beep of monitors from behind closed doors. The walls here were painted in warm earth tones, the kind meant to soothe, but they only made her more aware of her own heartbeat. When she reached the door to 502, she hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the handle. She could still turn back. She could leave him to recover and let this morning fade into memory. But something deep in her insisted that she open that door. She pushed it slowly. Daniel Langford was sitting up in bed, propped against crisp white pillows. The harsh pallor she had seen on his face yesterday had softened, replaced by a faint flush. He wore a simple hospital gown, but even here, in this sterile space, he carried himself with an air of quiet authority. A book rested open in his lap, but his eyes lifted to meet hers as soon as she stepped inside. "You came," he said. His voice roughened but steady. She shut the door gently behind her. "You asked." A flicker of a smile touched his mouth. "I wasn't sure you would." Clara crossed to the chair beside his bed, her posture careful. "I didn't want to intrude." "You didn't intrude," he said quietly. "You acted when I couldn't. That makes you the opposite of an intruder." For a moment, the hum of machines and the distant murmur of voices outside the door were the only sounds. He studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she didn't. "I remember your voice," he continued, "even when everything else was fading. I heard it. Calm, certain. I've had people around me my whole life, staff, advisors, security. But in that moment, it was you I trusted." She didn't know what to do with that. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag in her lap. "I only did what I was trained to do years ago." He tilted his head slightly. "Trained?" She hesitated. "I was studying to be a nurse. I didn't finish." "Why not?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. She hadn't told that story in years. Life happened. She said at last, "My sister got sick. Bills piled up. I needed money faster than a degree could give it to me. Cleaning work was steady. He didn't press her, though she could feel the question lingering in his silence. Instead, he reached to the side table and picked up a small envelope. "This is for you." She frowned. "What is it?" "A gesture," he said simply, holding it out. She didn't take it right away. "I'm not looking for it." "Not payment," he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "It's an invitation." Curiosity won over caution. She took the envelope and opened it to find a single, heavy cardstock card with embossed lettering. It was an invitation to a charity gala hosted by Langford Enterprises, the kind of event she had only seen in glossy magazines left behind. In waiting rooms, her name was written in neat script across the top. She looked up at him. "Why would you want me there?" "Because," he said, leaning back against the pillows, "sometimes the people who think they don't belong somewhere are the ones who should be there most." She didn't answer right away. The idea of standing in a room filled with people in glittering gowns and tailored suits felt absurd. She would stick out like a misplaced piece in a perfect puzzle. But there was something in his expression, a quiet conviction, that made it harder to dismiss. "Think about it," he said. "No pressure. Just don't say no yet." She slipped the card back into its envelope, unsure what to feel. Gratitude, perhaps. Confusion, definitely. A strange current of possibility that both scared and intrigued her. As she rose to leave, he said, "Clara." She paused at the door. "You saved my life. I don't forget things like that." She walked back through the silent corridors with the envelope tucked under her arm, the weight of it entirely disproportionate to its size. Outside, the late afternoon sun had begun to sink, turning the city's glass towers into sheets of molten gold. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the flow of strangers passing by. The invitation felt like a door, one she hadn't known existed until now, and she couldn't stop wondering what might be on the other side if she dared to open it. What Clara didn't realize was that accepting it would do more than change her life. It would pull her into a chain of events where every choice mattered, and where the smallest decision could tip everything toward redemption or ruin. And for the first time in years, she found herself almost wanting to take that risk. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, sharp wind that swept down the avenues, tugging at coats and bending the halos of streetlight into hazy gold. Clara stood outside the towering glass facade of the Langford Grand Ballroom, clutching the edge of her borrowed evening wrap like a lifeline. She had stared at her reflection in the mirror for nearly an hour before leaving her apartment, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back. The dress, a simple navy gown that skimmed the floor, had been loaned to her by her neighbor, and though it fit surprisingly well, she still felt as though she were wearing someone else's life. Through the transparent walls of the ballroom, she could see the movement of glittering dresses and the glint of cufflinks under soft chandeliers. A string quartet played somewhere inside, its music weaving through the laughter and polite conversation of the city's wealthiest and most powerful. Clara hesitated, feeling the invisible weight of every eye she imagined might turn toward her the moment she stepped inside. But then she remembered the look in Daniel Langford's eyes when he had handed her the invitation. Not pity, not charity, but something steadier, like a quiet challenge. That memory pushed her forward. She gave her name to the attendant at the entrance, who checked the list and, without hesitation, opened the heavy glass door. Warmth and light enveloped her. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided through the crowd with trays of champagne. The hum of conversation was steady, almost musical, but as Clara stepped deeper into the room, she realized she wasn't invisible here the way she was in the penthouse. People noticed her, perhaps because she was unfamiliar, or perhaps because she carried herself differently tonight. She scanned the room, searching for Daniel, and found him near the center, speaking with a small cluster of guests. He was no longer the pale, fragile figure she had seen in the hospital. Tonight, he stood tall in a tailored black suit, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. When his eyes caught hers across the room, his conversation seemed to pause mid-sentence. A faint smile curved his lips, and he excused himself from the group. "You came," he said when he reached her, his tone warm but touched with a note of satisfaction. "You invited me," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "And you accepted," he countered. "That's not nothing." Before she could answer, a man in his 60s approached, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He looked at Daniel with the familiarity of an old acquaintance, then at Clara with polite curiosity. "You're keeping your guests a mystery. Tonight, Daniel, this is Clara Marin," Daniel said smoothly. "She's the reason I'm standing here instead of lying in a hospital bed." The man's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Is that so?" Clara offered a modest smile, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just happened to be there." Daniel shook his head slightly, but didn't argue. Instead, he guided her toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the curious stares. "You'll get used to that tonight," he said. "People will want to know who you are. They'll ask questions. Just tell them the truth, or as much of it as you want to share." She wasn't sure she wanted to share any of it, but she followed him, weaving between clusters of guests, catching fragments of conversation about markets, investments, and things she barely understood. Yet there was something about the rhythm of the evening, the way the light seemed to bend around the chandeliers, that made her feel oddly present. After a while, Daniel led her onto a small balcony overlooking the city. The air was colder here, but the view was worth it. A sea of lights stretching to the horizon, each one a reminder that millions of stories were unfolding at the same time. "I wanted you to see this," Daniel said quietly. "When you're up here, it's easy to think you're above it all, but you're not. Every light out there belongs to someone's life, and sometimes the smallest light can change the whole skyline." Clara studied him, unsure if he was speaking about the city or about her. "Is that why you invited me?" He met her gaze. "Partly, but there's something else." The way he said it made her chest tighten. She waited, but he didn't go on. Instead, he looked back at the city as if weighing his words. Before she could press him, the balcony door opened and Henry stepped out, his expression carefully neutral. "Sorry to interrupt," Henry said, "but you're needed inside. It's about the presentation." Daniel gave a brief nod, then turned back to Clara. "Will you stay until the end?" She hesitated, then said, "I'll stay." Something in his expression softened, but he didn't linger. He followed Henry back inside, leaving her alone with the view. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the wind tug at the hem of her dress. Through the glass, she could see him at the podium a few minutes later, speaking to the assembled guests. She couldn't hear his words from here, but the room's attention was locked on him. There was something magnetic about the way he held the space. Even without raising his voice, she should have gone back inside. Instead, she stayed on the balcony, letting the city lights blur into soft halos. She didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, she would overhear something, a fragment of conversation not meant for her, that would change the way she saw Daniel Langford entirely. And when that moment came, it would leave her, wondering whether she had stepped into a story where she was meant to help him, or to save herself. The balcony door was still ajar, letting a sliver of warm light spill out into the cool night air. Clara turned slightly, meaning to rejoin the crowd, but paused when two voices drifted through, low, measured, and just sharp enough to cut through the background hum of the gala. She couldn't see the speakers from where she stood, but their words carried in brief, clipped exchanges. "He's not ready to hear it," one voice said. "Older, gravel-edged. He has to," the other replied. "If he keeps pushing like this, the next episode could be worse." There was a pause, the sound of a glass being set down. "You think he'll listen? He's stubborn, but he's not reckless, not usually." Clara's pulse quickened. She knew they were speaking about Daniel. There was no mistaking the weight in their tone. The conversation faded as the men moved further into the room, but the words stuck, circling in her mind like restless birds. She slipped back inside, careful to blend into the movement of guests. Daniel was still at the podium, his voice carrying. Now as he thanked the crowd for their contributions and spoke about the charity's work funding community health programs, it struck her, the irony of a man who had nearly collapsed in his own living room, now speaking about health with unwavering conviction. When he finished, the applause was warm and sustained. He stepped down, greeted by a handful of guests, and for a while Clara lost sight of him. She wandered near the back of the room, drawn to a display of photographs from previous year's projects, children in newly built playgrounds, families receiving medical care, volunteers planting community gardens. There was sincerity in the images that reminded her of why she had once wanted to be a nurse. Enjoying herself, she turned to see Henry standing beside her. His expression was polite, but there was a glint in his eyes that suggested he was evaluating her. "It's different," she said honestly. "Different can be good," he replied. Then, after a pause, "You've noticed, haven't you, that he's not quite himself lately?" The question startled her. "You mean because of—" "I mean because there's more going on than he tells most people." Henry interrupted. "I'm not saying this to alarm you, but you have a way of reaching him. If you're going to be around, you should know the ground you're standing on." Clara searched his face for more, but he simply offered a brief nod and melted back into the crowd. Before she could ask another question, the rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, polite small talk, and the quiet sense that something invisible was humming beneath the surface. When the gala finally wound down and the guests began to leave, Daniel found her near the exit. "Walk with me," he said. They stepped out into the cold night together, the city humming around them. A black car waited at the curb, but instead of getting in, Daniel gestured toward the small park across the street. They crossed together, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound for a while. "I used to come here when I couldn't think," he said, hands in his coat pockets. "Before the company got so big, before my life was scheduled to the minute." They stopped near a bench, the glow of a nearby street lamp casting long shadows. He looked at her then, and there was none of the polished composure he'd worn. "Inside, I heard you met Henry tonight," he said. "He probably gave you a hint that there's more to the story." Clara nodded slowly. "He said you weren't quite yourself lately." Daniel exhaled, a faint cloud in the cold air. "I've been sick for longer than I've let on. The episode you saw wasn't the first, and it won't be the last unless I make some changes. But changes mean stepping back, and stepping back means—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "The company is my life. I built it from nothing. I don't know who I am without it." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. She had seen power, composure, control, but this was different. "You're still you," she said quietly, "even without the company." He gave a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "You make it sound simple." "Sometimes it is," she replied. They stood in silence for a while, the city sounds softened by the winter air. Finally, he said, "Come by the penthouse tomorrow. I want to talk to you about something, an idea." She wanted to ask what kind of idea, but the tone in his voice told her it was something significant. As they walked back toward the waiting car, Clara felt the same pull she'd felt the day she found him in distress, the sense that she was stepping into a moment she couldn't quite see the edges of yet. And what she didn't know was that the idea he planned to share would ask more of her than she had ever imagined, and force her to decide how far she was willing to go for someone who was still, in many ways, a stranger. The next morning, the city was wrapped in a gray haze that made the skyline look softer, almost blurred. Clara climbed the steps to the Langford Tower with her scarf pulled tight against the cold, the wind chasing at her heels. She had barely slept, her thoughts looping endlessly over Daniel's words in the park. An idea, he'd said, but what kind of idea could a man like him have for a woman like her? The doorman greeted her by name, something that had never happened before, and ushered her toward the private elevator. By the time the doors opened on the top floor, she'd braced herself for almost anything. Daniel was waiting in the living room, dressed casually in a sweater and dark trousers. Though even in simplicity he carried the same quiet authority. The fire was lit, throwing warm light over the room's pale marble and glass. He stood as she entered. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You made it sound important," she replied, setting her bag down. "It is." He gestured toward the sofa, and when they both sat, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "You know, what happened to me wasn't just a what-I'm thing. My doctors have been warning me for years to slow down, to take care of myself. I didn't listen. But the last episode made me realize something. I can't keep living the way I have been. If I do, it's only a matter of time before. He let the sentence trail off, but the meaning hung heavy between them. I've been thinking about stepping away from day-to-day operations, he continued. But if I do that, I need someone I can trust to help me keep my promises to my employees, to my projects, and to the communities we support. Clara blinked, unsure where he was going. And you think that's me? I know it is, he said without hesitation. You have instincts most people spend a lifetime trying to fake. You saw what was happening to me before anyone else did. You acted without hesitation, without thinking about what it might cost. That's the kind of judgment I need. She shook her head slightly. I clean your floors. I don't run companies. He smiled faintly. I'm not asking you to run the company. I'm asking you to be my eyes and ears while I step back, to be in the rooms I can't be in, to tell me the truth no one else will. It's not about knowing the business, it's about knowing people, and you do. The idea felt impossible, yet there was a thread of logic in it she couldn't ignore. Still, the thought of entering his world on those terms made her uneasy. Why me? You have people who've worked with you for years, people with degrees and agendas. He cut in gently. I have a lot of people who want what's best for the company. I have very few who care about what's best for me. The honesty in his voice disarmed her. She studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw the man beneath the reputation. Someone who was tired, maybe even afraid, but still fighting to keep control of his own life. I'd need time to think about it, she said. At last, you have it, he replied, but not too much time. The next few weeks are going to be complicated. I need to know if I can count on you. Before she could answer, Henry appeared in the doorway. Daniel, the board call is in 10 minutes. Daniel gave a small nod, then turned back to her. Stay for lunch if you can. We'll talk more after, she agreed, though part of her wondered if she'd just agreed to more than she realized. While he stepped away to take the call, Clara wandered toward the windows. The city stretched out endlessly below, a patchwork of rooftops and streets that looked almost peaceful from up here. She thought about the life she'd built, small, steady, safe, and how this single decision could shatter it completely. As she stood there, voices drifted in from Daniel's study. The door was mostly closed, but not enough to muffle the tension in the words. If they find out about the projections, we'll lose control of the deal, a voice said. Daniel's reply was lower, but sharp. That's why they can't find out. Not yet. We're not ready. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She didn't understand the details, but she knew enough to hear the risk in it. Whatever he was dealing with wasn't just about health. There were stakes here she hadn't considered. When he returned, his expression was composed, but Clara caught the faint trace of strain in his jaw. You look like you have questions, he said. Only about whether you're telling me everything, she replied. A corner of his mouth lifted, but it didn't reach his eyes, not yet. But if you take the role I'm offering you, you'll know more than you might want to. And there it was, the hook she couldn't quite resist, and the warning she couldn't quite ignore. As she left that afternoon, the envelope with the offer tucked into her bag, she knew she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than either of them had said out loud. She also knew that once she stepped over that edge, there would be no going back to the quiet life she'd known. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this choice would not only change her future but force her to face truths about Daniel Langford that could either bind them together or tear them apart. And the moment of decision was coming faster than she thought.